My name is Alara, and I am 47 years old. For most of my life, my world has been the size of a garden, a small patch of earth where I coaxed life and remedies from the soil. They called me a healer in the village of Oakhaven, at least for a time. They would come to my cottage on the edge of the woods with their fevers, their injuries, their aches that the priest's prayers couldn't soothe. I asked for nothing in return but a bit of bread or a few eggs, if they could spare them. But fear is a bitter root, and it grows in the dark soil of ignorance and jealousy. The same hands that once reached for my help eventually reached for stones. The same voices that once blessed my name eventually screamed for my burning. They accused me of witchcraft, of communing with dark forces to poison their lives. And in their terror, they sent for an Inquisitor, a man whose very name was a whispered threat across the land, a man of iron will and unshakable faith, sent to purify the world with fire. I never expected that the stern, feared judge sent to preside over my trial, the man who held my life in his hands, would be the one person in the entire world who owed me his own. Before I dive into the story of how a secret act of mercy on a forgotten battlefield returned to either save me or condemn me, I'd love to know where all of you are watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt misunderstood or falsely accused, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers out there, please consider subscribing to join our community of storytellers and survivors. My life in Oakhaven had always been one of quiet solitude, a rhythm set by the sun and the seasons. My cottage was small, nestled just where the farmers' fields gave way to the deep, ancient woods. It had belonged to my mother, and her mother before her. The garden was our legacy, a sprawling, chaotic library of herbs, flowers, and roots. Each plant had a purpose, a secret language my mother had taught me. Foxglove for a weak heart, but only a leaf, never more. Willow bark for fevers. Yarrow to staunch the flow of blood. Comfrey, the knit bone, to mend what was broken. I lived by this knowledge. It was as much a part of me as the blood in my veins. The villagers were a cautious people, steeped in tradition and the rigid doctrines of the faith. They attended the chapel, listened to Father Lorcan's sermons about sin and damnation, and kept a wary eye on the woods that hemmed them in. Yet life was hard, and the priest's blessings didn't always mend a deep gash from a scythe or cool the brow of a feverish child. So they came to me. They came in trickles at first. A farmer, Gawan, had a wicked infection in his hand, a angry red line creeping up his arm. The village sawbones had wanted to take the arm off at the elbow. His wife came to me, weeping, begging. I spent 2 days applying poultices of honey and moldy bread, forcing bitter teas down his throat. The fever broke, the red line receded. Gawan kept his arm. He never spoke of it in the village square, but he left a sack of potatoes on my doorstep, and his eyes held a gratitude deeper than words. Then it was little Meve, the baker's daughter, seized with a cough that rattled her small frame. I made a syrup of horehound and honey, and sat with her through the night, steaming the air with thyme. Her breathing eased. Her parents pressed a warm loaf of bread into my hands. The next morning, their relief a palpable thing. I healed rashes, soothed aching joints, and even helped birth a few babies when the midwife was unavailable. I was a part of the village, yet always apart from it. I was useful, necessary, but never truly one of them. The whispers began with Morwen. She was the widow of the old apothecary, a man who had sold expensive, often ineffective tinctures from a dusty shop in the center of the village. He had resented my mother, and Morwen inherited that resentment, nurturing it like a prized, poisonous flower. After his death, the shop had fallen into disuse, but her bitterness had not. She saw my work not as healing, but as a theft of the respect and station she felt was rightfully hers. She was a woman whose influence was woven from gossip and insinuation, and she began to weave a tapestry of fear around me. It started subtly. A child I had healed from a summer sickness was suddenly described as having been bewitched and then unbewitched. The farmer whose cow had been barren until I fed it a mash of red clover was now said to be raising an unnatural beast. Morwen would stand with a clutch of other women by the village well, her voice just loud enough to carry. "It's not right," she'd say. Her face a mask of pious concern. Healing should come from the grace of the Almighty, from prayer and penance. Her methods, they are of the earth. The dark earth. She planted the seeds, and in the fertile ground of their superstition, they began to sprout. I first noticed the change in the market. Eyes that once met mine with a shy smile now skittered away. Mothers would pull their children closer as I passed. The baker who had been so grateful for his daughter's life now seemed to find his flour sacks intensely interesting whenever I approached his stall. The air grew thick with a suspicion I could feel but not grasp. It was like trying to catch smoke in my hands. My few friends grew distant. Lena, a weaver whose loom I had often sat beside, stopped visiting. When I saw her by the stream, she gave me a pained, apologetic look and hurried away, as if my very presence could taint her. Loneliness, which had always been a quiet companion, now became a heavy shroud. I tried to ignore it, to pour my energy into my garden and my work. I told myself that truth was a hardy plant, that it would eventually push through the weeds of their fear. I was wrong. The isolation deepened, becoming a wall between my cottage and the rest of the village. Children who used to dare each other to touch my garden gate now ran past, making signs against evil. The sack of potatoes and the loaf of bread stopped appearing on my doorstep. I was an outcast. I began to talk to the plants, my voice a low murmur against the rustle of leaves. They were my only confidants. I would tell the chamomile about the ache in my chest, the rosemary about the bitterness of betrayal. They, at least, did not judge. They simply grew, reaching for the sun, their purpose clean and honest. One evening, as dusk settled like a purple bruise over the valley, a young man named Tomas stumbled to my door. He was Goan's eldest son, a boy I had known since he was a toddler. His face was pale with panic, his hands shaking. "It's my father," he gasped. He was clearing the old stones at the north field. One fell. His leg. "Elara, it's bad." I grabbed my satchel of supplies without a second thought. The fear in the village was an abstract thing. A crushed limb was real, immediate. I followed Thomas at a run, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and purpose. We found Gaywan lying by a massive standing stone, his face gray with shock and pain. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee, the bone clearly shattered. I knelt beside him, my hands moving with an instinct born of long practice. I gave him a wad of willow bark to chew for the pain and set about cleaning the wound where the bone had nearly broken the skin. "We need to set it," I told Thomas, my voice calm and steady despite the tremor in my own hands. "Hold him steady. This will hurt." Together, under the light of a hastily lit torch, we worked. I pulled the bone into place with a sickening crunch that made Gaywan scream, a sound that was quickly muffled as he bit down on a strip of leather. I splinted the leg with sturdy branches and bound it tight with strips of cloth. I applied a comfrey root poultice to the bruising, the knit bones to begin its silent work. "Get him home," I instructed Thomas and the other farmhands who had gathered. "Keep him warm. I'll bring a tea for the pain and fever." I walked back to my cottage under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. I felt a flicker of hope. An act like this, a life saved from ruin, surely this would remind them of who I was. Surely this would be enough. But as I neared my home, I saw it. Painted on my door in what looked like pig's blood was the jagged, accusing symbol of the evil eye. The flicker of hope died, replaced by a cold dread that settled deep in my bones. They had not seen a healing. They had seen a sign, a confirmation of Morwen's whispers. They believed I had used dark powers to mend Gaywan's leg, a feat too swift, too effective to be natural. I had not earned their trust. I had only sealed my fate. I stood there for a long time, the scent of blood and herbs clinging to me, and for the first time I was truly afraid of the people I had spent my life trying to heal. The blight came a month later. It began in the wheat fields, a creeping blackness that withered the stalks and turned the grain to dust. It spread to the barley, then the root vegetables, a foul-smelling rot that consumed the village's hopes for the winter. Panic settled over Oakhaven like a pestilence. The stores were meager, and the prospect of a long, hungry winter turned their fear into a sharp, dangerous thing. They needed a reason. A blight of this magnitude was not natural, they murmured. It was a curse. It was the work of a witch. Morwen, who had been waiting for such a moment, did not hesitate. She stood before the chapel after a grim Sunday service, her voice ringing with the fire of self-righteous certainty. "It is her," she cried, pointing a trembling finger in the direction of my cottage. "Alara, she who works with strange roots and whispers to the weeds, she has brought this upon us. She saved Gawain's leg with unnatural arts, and now she sours the very earth beneath our feet as payment to her dark master." The accusation hung in the air, terrible and final. It was the spark that ignited the tinder of their fear. A low murmur grew into a roar. The villagers, their faces twisted with hunger and terror, became a single entity, a mob moving with one mind, one purpose. I heard them coming before I saw them. It was a sound like a landslide, a rumbling of feet and angry shouts that shook the very ground. I looked out my small window and saw them swarming up the path, a sea of torches and pitchforks, their faces monstrous in the flickering light. There was Gawain, his leg healing but his eyes full of fear, swept along by the tide. There was the baker, his face grim, and Lena, the weaver, her face pale and tear-streaked as she was jostled by the crowd. My heart seized in my chest. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. There was nowhere to run. The forest was behind me, but they would hunt me down. The door splintered under the first heavy blow. They poured into my small cottage, their bodies filling the space, their torches casting dancing, demonic shadows on the walls. They overturned my table, smashing the clay pots and vials of dried herbs. The carefully gathered work of a lifetime crunched under their boots, the air filling with the mingled scents of lavender, mint, and their raw, unwashed fury. Morwen was at the forefront, her eyes blazing with triumph. "Hey!" she shrieked, pointing to a bundle of nightshade I kept for making a pain-relieving salve, always used with extreme care. "See? The devil's own berries. Poison!" A large farmer grabbed my arm, his grip like an iron band. I didn't struggle. I knew it was useless. They dragged me out into the night, my bare feet stumbling over the roots and stones of the path. They threw me into the village's small damp lockup, a stone cell reeking of mildew and despair, and bolted the heavy wooden door. Through the small barred window I could see the glow of their torches as they ransacked my home, destroying everything I had. The noise eventually faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of my own heart. I sank onto the cold stone floor, pulling my knees to my chest. In the darkness, alone, my mind fled from the terrifying present and sought refuge in the past, in a memory that had been my most guarded secret. It was 10 years ago. The border wars were raging, a senseless conflict that had bled the kingdom for a generation. My mother and I were traveling, fleeing a skirmish that had destroyed our old village. We were skilled at being invisible, moving through the woods like wraiths. One afternoon, near the contested lands of the Blackwood, we stumbled upon the aftermath of a cavalry charge. The clearing was a charnel house of men and horses. The crows were already gathering. We were about to retreat when I heard it. A low moan, almost lost beneath the buzz of flies. My mother tried to stop me, her hand tight on my arm. "We don't get involved with soldiers, Alara. It's too dangerous." But the sound pulled at me. I crept forward and found him half submerged in a muddy ditch. He was a knight, though his fine surcoat was ripped and soaked in blood. He was young, no more than 20, with dark hair matted to his brow and a face that, even in unconsciousness, was set in a stern, proud line. A deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder down his chest, and his left wrist was laid open to the bone. He was burning with fever, his breathing shallow. He was dying. "We can't just leave him," I whispered to my mother. She looked from the dying night to my face, and she relented. For 2 days we stayed hidden in a small cave nearby, tending to him. We had so little, but we used what we had. I cleaned his wounds with a decoction of yarrow. My mother prepared a potent, bitter tea of willow bark and feverfew, and I had to pry his teeth open to force it down his throat. The wound on his chest was deep and festering. I packed it with moss soaked in honey and prayed it would draw out the poison. The cut on his wrist was cleaner. I stitched it myself, my fingers clumsy with a bone needle, the thread I used to mend our clothes. The scar it would leave, I knew, would be puckered and rough. I remember the feel of his skin, hot and dry. I remember the scent of blood, mud, and the herbs we used. I never saw his eyes open. On the third morning, his fever had broken. His breathing was deeper, more even. We heard the sound of a patrol in the distance. We couldn't risk being found. "He will live now if he's strong," my mother said. We took one last look at the sleeping nobleman and slipped away back into the forest, leaving no trace we were ever there. I never forgot his face. I never forgot the feel of his skin or the shape of the scar I had given him. A week passed in the cell. The villagers left me bread and water, their faces averted, as if looking at me too long might invite the same curse. Father Lorcan came once, his hands trembling as he held his holy symbol. He urged me to confess, to save my soul, his voice thin and reedy. I told him I had nothing to confess. He left, looking more terrified than I felt. Then the news came. The Lord Inquisitor was arriving. The name was spoken in hushed, terrified tones. Alaric Kalen. They said he was the Order's sharpest blade, a man who could smell heresy the way a hound smells a fox. They said his justice was swift and merciless. When the day came, the whole village gathered in the square. I was brought out in chains, blinking against the sudden sunlight. A procession of 5 men on horseback rode into the village, their armor gleaming, the symbol of the Inquisition emblazoned on their banners. The man at their lead was tall and imposing. He dismounted, his movements precise and economical. He wore black leather and polished steel, and a heavy cloak hung from his shoulders. He surveyed the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them with an unnerving intensity that made them shrink back. Then his eyes found me. My breath caught in my throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. His face was harder now, etched with lines of authority and a weariness that hadn't been there a decade ago. But it was him. The dark hair, the proud set of his jaw, the face I had seen only in fevered unconsciousness. It was the knight from the ditch. It was Lord Inquisitor, Alaric Kalen. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest, and I choked it back. Of all the men in the world they could have sent, it was him. He looked at me, and I saw nothing. No flicker of recognition, no hint of a shared past. To him I was just another accused witch in another wretched backwater village. His eyes were cold steel. He began his investigation immediately, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through the nervous silence. He interviewed the village elders, Father Lorcan, and then, one by one, my accusers. I watched from my cell as Morwen spoke to him, her gestures animated, her face a performance of grief and fear. I saw him listen, his face impassive, his gaze never wavering. He was a vessel of the law, a man who had stripped himself of all sentiment. The boy I had saved was gone, replaced by this unyielding instrument of judgment. My secret, the one thing that connected us, was a fragile thread. If I pulled on it, would it save me, or would it simply snap, leaving me to fall? The hope that had flared for a wild, impossible moment now felt like the cruelest kind of joke. The Inquisitor whose life I had saved did not remember me, and he was here to sentence me to death. The day of the trial was unnaturally bright, the sky a harsh, cloudless blue. They erected a platform in the center of the village square, a crude stage for the final act of this tragedy. I was led from my cell, the chains on my wrists and ankles clanking with each step. The entire village was assembled, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a grim, righteous hunger. They stared at me not as Alara, the woman who had soothed their children's fevers, but as a monster, the source of all their misfortune. At a heavy wooden table on the platform sat Lord Inquisitor Alaric Kalen. He looked as if he were carved from stone, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid with authority. Two of his guards stood behind him, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The proceedings began. Father Lorcan gave a stammering, fearful account of the unnatural events that had plagued his parish, his eyes constantly darting towards Alaric as if seeking approval. Then came the villagers. One after another they stepped forward, their testimonies a garbled litany of twisted truths and outright lies, all orchestrated by Morwen's whispers. A woman claimed a love charm I had given her. In reality, a simple herbal tea to calm her anxieties before her wedding had soured her marriage. A farmer swore that a poultice I'd made for his lame horse had given the beast the strength to kick down his neighbor's fence in a demonic rage. They presented the evidence: a bundle of withered, blighted wheat, a pouch of dried herbs they couldn't identify, a small wooden doll I had carved for a child, now claimed to be an object of malevolent sorcery. Through it all I stood silent, my gaze fixed on Alaric. He listened to each testimony with unwavering focus, his dark eyes missing nothing. He betrayed no emotion, no hint of what he was thinking. His duty was a shield, and he held it up against the world, against me. Finally, it was Morwen's turn. She was a master performer. She wept as she described my corruption of the village, her voice thick with false sorrow. She spoke of my solitude, my strange garden, my refusal to attend chapel regularly, weaving it all into a narrative of deliberate, calculated evil. She offered us healing. Morwen cried, her voice rising to a dramatic crescendo, but it was a poisoned gift. She mended our bodies only to blight our souls and our lands. The crowd murmured in agreement, their fear stoked to a fever pitch. When she finished, a heavy silence fell. Alaric turned his gaze to me. It was my turn to speak. "Alara of Oakhaven," he said, his voice cold and formal, devoid of any personal inflection. "You have heard the accusations against you. What say you in your defense?" I took a breath, the air tasting of dust and hatred. I would not beg. I would not weep. I would speak the truth, even if it was the last thing I ever did. "My name is Alara," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than I expected. "I am a healer. The herbs you see as tools of darkness are gifts from the earth. The nightshade you call poison can, in the right hands, ease unbearable pain. The yarrow can stop a man from bleeding to death. The willow bark can break a fever that would otherwise claim a life." I looked out at the faces in the crowd, at Gaywan, whose leg was now strong enough for him to stand and watch me be condemned. I have done nothing but use the knowledge passed down to me by my mother to help those in need. The blight is a sickness of the earth, not a curse from my hand. Your fear is the only poison here. Alaric's expression remained unchanged. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You speak of knowledge, of fevers and wounds. Your craft seems extensive. Tell me, what would you do for a deep, festering gash on a man's chest, one that weeps with infection and smells of death?" My heart hammered against my ribs. Was this a test? A random question? Or something more? "I would clean it," I replied, my voice steady. "I would pack it with honey and moss, to draw out the foulness. I would give him teas of feverfew to fight the heat in his blood." He continued, his voice relentless, pressing, and a wound on the arm, a cut so deep it severs the muscle and sinew, threatening the limb. This was it. The moment hung suspended in time. "I would stitch it," I said, my gaze dropping pointedly to his left hand, which rested on the table. With a clean needle and strong thread. It would heal, but it would leave a scar. A reminder. He followed my gaze. For a fleeting second, his eyes rested on the faint, silvery line that puckered the skin of his wrist. A line I knew as well as I knew my own reflection. I saw a flicker. Not of recognition, but of something deeper. Confusion. A shadow of a memory he couldn't place. I could see the battle in his eyes, the iron wall of his duty warring with a ghost he didn't understand. The scent of willow bark, the taste of a bitter tonic, the feel of damp earth, a whisper from a past he had buried. His jaw tightened. He looked away from his hand, his mask of cold authority slipping back into place, but not before I had seen the crack. "These are convenient answers," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Words are easy. Confess your sins, woman. Confess, and the Almighty may yet have mercy on your soul." The crowd surged with anticipation. "Burn her," someone shouted. The chant was taken up by others. "Burn the witch." I looked at him, this man of law and order, this man whose life had been a secret between us for a decade. He was going to condemn me. He was going to let me burn to protect a duty that was built on a life I had saved. Desperation gave me a final surge of courage. I would not reveal his secret, for that would be seen as a threat, a witch's blackmail. I had to reach the man, not the Inquisitor. "My Lord Inquisitor," I said, my voice ringing out over the bloodthirsty cries of the crowd. "You speak of duty. I ask you, as a man of honor, has there ever been a moment in your life when duty was not enough? A moment where your life hung not by a thread of law or doctrine, but by a simple, anonymous act of mercy from a stranger?" My words hung in the air, his eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I saw it. The wall of the Inquisitor crumbled. He saw me, not the accused witch, not the heretic before him, but a ghost from a muddy ditch. He remembered, the memory, fragmented and sensory, rushed back into him, the gentle, skilled hands working on his ruined body, the quiet determination of a girl who should have run, a girl who had no duty to him, no reason to risk her own life for his. He was not just a judge presiding over a case. He was a debtor before his creditor. The crowd's chanting faded to a dull roar in his ears. His duty screamed at him to pronounce the verdict the law demanded. His conscience, his very soul, screamed a debt that could never be repaid with silver or gold, only with a life for a life. His face, which had been a mask of implacable judgment, was now a portrait of agonizing conflict. He stood up, his chair scraping against the rough wood of the platform. The crowd fell silent, expecting the final terrible sentence. He looked at me, and then he looked out at the sea of hateful, fearful faces. He took a deep breath and made his choice. Silence. Alaric's voice was not a shout, but it cracked through the air with the authority of a thunderclap. The last murmurs of the crowd died instantly. Every eye was fixed on him. He did not look at me. Instead, his gaze swept over the villagers, cold and assessing, and for the first time they seemed to see not a savior who had come to confirm their fears, but a judge who had come to weigh their souls. He turned his attention to Morwen, who stood with a smug, expectant look on her face. "You," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You are the primary accuser. You claim this woman blighted the fields. Tell me, did you see her do it?" Morwen blinked, taken aback. "Well, no, my lord, not with my own eyes, but did anyone?" Alaric's voice cut her off, rising in volume. He scanned the crowd. "Did any of you see this woman near the fields at night? Did any of you see her perform a ritual, speak a curse, or do anything at all to harm the crops?" A nervous shuffling passed through the crowd. No one spoke. Eyes darted to the ground. Their certainty, so strong and unified a moment ago, began to fracture under his intense scrutiny. "So your accusation is based on nothing but suspicion and fear," Alaric stated, his tone dripping with contempt. He picked up the pouch of evidence from the table. "You claim these herbs are poison." He looked at Gawain, who was leaning heavily on a crutch. Gawain, step forward. Gawain paled, but limped onto the platform. This woman treated your leg, did she not? Alaric asked. Yes, my lord, Gawain mumbled. And you live. You stand here on 2 legs, not 1. Her poison seems to have served you well. Gawain flushed with shame and looked away. Alaric then turned back to a visibly trembling Morwen. You were the wife of the village apothecary. You should have some knowledge of remedies. Do you recognize this herb? He held up a sprig of dried comfrey. Morwen shook her head mutely. It is comfrey, Alaric said, his voice booming across the square. Commonly known as knitbones for its properties in mending broken bones. And this? He held up a piece of willow bark, a simple remedy for fever and pain, known to any halfway competent healer. Your ignorance is matched only by your malice. He moved with the deliberate pace of a hunter cornering his prey. He tore apart every piece of their testimony with relentless, cold logic. He exposed the contradictions, the hearsay, the petty jealousies that underpinned their accusations. The woman with the soured marriage was forced to admit her husband was a drunkard long before she met me. The farmer with the demonic horse conceded the fence had been rotten for years. Under the force of his interrogation, their web of lies disintegrated. Morwen began to weep. But these were not the calculated tears of a performer. They were the frantic, desperate tears of a liar caught in the light. She is unnatural. Morwen finally sobbed. She doesn't belong here. And you have decided you are the arbiter of who belongs. Alaric's voice was ice. You have taken your personal grievances and your superstitions, and you have sought to murder a woman with them. You have wasted the time and resources of the Holy Inquisition, an offense we do not take lightly. He stood to his full height, his shadow falling over the terrified villagers. I find no evidence of witchcraft here. I find only fear, ignorance, and a malicious conspiracy to commit murder, led by this woman. He pointed a single damning finger at Morwen. I find the accused Alara of Oakhaven to be innocent of all charges. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. It was a sound of disbelief, of thwarted bloodlust. He wasn't finished. For the crime of bearing false witness and attempting to pervert the course of sacred justice, I sentence Morwen to 1 year of public penance and house arrest. The village of Oakhaven will pay a fine of 500 silver crowns to the order for this frivolous and malicious summons. Let this be a lesson. The Inquisition hunts true heresy, not the phantoms of your petty hatreds. He slammed his gauntlet fist on the table, the sound echoing the finality of his judgment. This trial is over. He gave a sharp nod to his guards, who moved immediately to strike the chains from my wrists and ankles. The crowd was stunned into silence, their fury replaced by a dawning terrible fear of the Inquisitor's wrath. They began to disperse, not with the triumphant roar they had anticipated, but in silent, shame-faced groups, refusing to meet my eyes or each other's. That night, long after the village had fallen into a cowed and uneasy sleep, the heavy door to my cell creaked open. Alaric stood there, alone, holding a single lantern. The light cast long shadows, making the small space feel like a confessional. He said nothing, simply stepped aside to let me out. I walked past him into the cool night air, taking a deep breath of freedom. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything that had been left unsaid for 10 years. The debt is paid, he finally said, his voice low and rough. He was not looking at me, but at the distant dark line of the forest. It was not an apology, nor was it a thank you. It was a statement of fact, a balancing of a ledger that only the two of us knew existed. I turned to face him. The lantern light softened the hard lines of his face, and for a moment I saw the young, vulnerable knight from the ditch. There was no debt, my lord, I replied softly. There was only a life that needed saving. Just as today, there was a life that needed justice. He finally met my gaze. His eyes, so cold and impenetrable during the trial, were now filled with a complex storm of emotions. This village is no longer safe for you, he said. They will not forgive you for being innocent, or for what I did to them. I can arrange for your passage, give you a letter of protection, a new life, somewhere far from here. It was a generous offer, a king's ransom, a chance to disappear and be safe forever. But the woman who had been dragged from her cottage a week ago was not the same woman who stood before him now. I had faced their hatred, faced the fire, and I had not been consumed. I would not leave as a protected refugee. "Thank you, my lord," I said, and I meant it. "But I will not run from them. I will leave this place, but I will do it on my own terms in my own time." A flicker of surprise, and perhaps respect, crossed his face. He simply nodded. "As you wish." He turned and walked away, his dark cloak melting into the shadows, leaving me alone under the stars, a free woman. The next morning, I walked through Oakhaven for the last time. The silence that greeted me was different from the one before. It was not the silence of shunning, but of fear and shame. Villagers scurried into their homes as I approached. Doors were closed quietly. Window shutters were drawn. Gowan stood by his cottage, his head bowed, unable to meet my eyes as I passed. I went to my home. It was a wreck. My life's work trampled into the dirt floor. But the garden, my beautiful, chaotic garden, was largely untouched. It was a survivor, like me. I spent the day gathering what I needed. I dug up the most precious roots, took cuttings from the hardiest plants, and collected seeds from the most potent flowers. I wrapped them carefully in damp moss and cloth. These were my legacy, my future. I packed a small bag with the few belongings that had survived the mob's fury. As the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley, I was ready. I did not look back at the cottage. I walked down the path and onto the main road, heading north, away from Oakhaven forever. From a ridge overlooking the village, a lone rider on a black horse watched me go until I was just a small speck on the horizon. Lord Inquisitor Alaric Kalen had remained to ensure my safe departure. Our paths would never cross again, but the invisible thread of mercy and debt would connect us across any distance, for the rest of our lives. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were my own. I traveled for a long time, learning from other healers, sharing my knowledge, and slowly, piece by piece, building a new life. I eventually settled in a green, fertile valley by a rushing river far to the north, a place where the old superstitions did not hold such a tight grip on the hearts of men. There, I planted my garden again. The roots and seeds from Oakhaven took hold and flourished. I did not build a cottage just for myself. I built a larger house, a place of learning and sanctuary. Young women and men who had a gift for healing came to learn from me. They learned to identify herbs, to make poultices and tinctures, to set bones and birth babies. But I taught them more than that. I taught them to be brave, to trust their knowledge, and to never let the fear of others extinguish the light of their calling. We became a community, a place of healing that was known for hundreds of miles. As for Alaric, I would hear whispers of him from time to time, carried by traveling merchants or pilgrims. He became known as Inquisitor Kailan the Just. They said he was still stern, still unyielding in his pursuit of true heresy, but that he was equally fierce in his defense of the innocent. They told stories of him exposing false accusations, punishing malicious accusers, and tempering the law with a wisdom that had not been there before. It seemed the trial in Oakhaven had changed him too. He had learned, as I had, that justice without mercy is just a sharper form of cruelty. My life was no longer defined by the hatred of a small village, but by the countless lives I had touched, the knowledge I had passed on. The scars of what happened in Oakhaven never fully faded, but they became a reminder not of pain, but of resilience. They taught me that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about the courage to get up, replant your garden, and grow again. I learned that a single act of kindness, given without expectation of reward, can echo through time in the most unexpected ways. It can become a debt, a shield, a verdict. It can save a life, and then, a decade later, it can save your own. That is the true magic in this world. It is not found in curses or spells, but in the simple, profound power of compassion. Have you ever had an experience where a past kindness returned to you in an unexpected way? I would be honored to read your stories in the comments below. It helps all of us to know that goodness does find its way back. If my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and unexpected justice. Sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it can make a world of difference. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for listening to my story with an open heart. I wish you all strength, courage, and the kindness of strangers.